My agent, my agent was contacted by the British publisher Thames and Hudson, and they wanted to know if I would be interested in doing a book as part of their myth series, because I think they have about 6 or 8 books in the series now. And Korean culture had become quite popular in England. You all know about the K-wave or Hallyu, as it's called. And they wanted to include a Korean book in the series. So um, somehow by default, I have become the leading expert on Korean folklore in the United States or in the English-speaking world. So I think he must have found a Google site or something about me. So I agreed to do it under the condition that Bella would help me because the Thames on Hudson books also include a lot of art. And Bella has a background in art history and very good research skills. So that's how the book came together. And then we divided up the task of doing the book and we outlined it. And Bella can tell you a bit about what she did on it.
Uh, well, you're really talking me up there. I mean, I think the truth is more like you wouldn't have been able to put out the book with your teaching schedule as a professor if you had been doing it all on your own. But, I remember what the acquisitions editor said, right? That an esteemed colleague had recommended you to him as a potential author. But it's true. I did get to work with a picture researcher for this book. The first time I've ever gotten to do anything of the sort, and exercise my art history knowledge in looking through Korean National Museum collections, um, to find images that would really help enrich the text. And when Insu and I divvied up the book, even though if anyone here has co-authored anything, if you co-author something, yes, there's our notebook that we worked in. It's never really clear in a co-authored work who exactly wrote what because you're both revising and discussing everything together. But mostly we divvied it up so that I focused on pre-modern and ancient Korea, and he mostly focused on more modern Korea and folk tales and pop culture. Although there were cases where that would switch and we would add sections to each other's sections as we went and would even like leave notes as we were drafting saying like, you add this thing or you add that thing. And the process was surprisingly smooth. I think we worked very well together. And we would draft many of our sections on paper just like that, as he shows me on screen right now. Um, there's one of the outlines that I made on our section on Buddhism in the religion chapter of the book. And there is an outline for every single chapter of the book in that notebook, which is very interesting. It's a book that didn't change significantly from the drafting to its final stage. Although there were cases where we talked to the editor at Thames and Hudson about what we should include, and we had to make decisions like, do we include all the Hangul, that's the Korean text? Should we include Hanja, that's Korean usage of Chinese characters for all the words? What words should they be if we do include them? Um, how will we address the separation between North and South Korea in the book? Um, Many political questions like that. In fact, I think I'm remembering this right, Dad. Didn't Thames and Hudson have to change where the book was printed because of some political issue that we included?
Yeah, they were having difficulty with China. They would they would generally have printed in China because it's cheapest there. But if they labeled the map in a way that did not favor the Chinese political interpretation of how maps should be labeled, some of you may remember the Barbie movie controversy, right? Um, they they knew that the Chinese printer would actually defer to the government, and so they ended up having it printed in Europe.
I remember it was a C, I think, on the map. That might have been the issue. And the book ended up being printed in Slovenia, I think. It looks beautiful though. I'll say that. So they did a great job.
Yes.
Um,
So here on the map, it says it's labeled Yellow Sea, right?
oh yeah, I just saw someone in the
Right? Yeah,
chat point out they would have wanted East China Sea
right.
as the name. That's exactly right. Um, I think the book also ended up being highly political to the point that a few of people who have reviewed the book have said things like, this book was really great when it included all the myths and folk tales, but the end part ended up really political. Um, but I think one thing that will become clear as we're giving this talk and this reading will be just how political myths are, and how they're maybe one of the most political things there is, I would say. The myths that we'll read to you tonight highlight so much about Korea's national character, and we've chosen stories that highlight many tropes that speak to Korea's culture. So, Dad, unless there was something else you wanted to reveal about how the book came to be, could
Yeah,
you share our slides
yeah.
and the
So
images?
I'll just make a comment about the when we were contacted, the publisher hadn't actually thought about the issue of North versus South Korea and the political and cultural divide, although the ancient cultural things all come from the same roots. What's happened in contemporary times is actually two radically different countries, and they they allowed us to address the issue in the second half of the book mostly. But one of the things the book does, which you really won't find anywhere else, is it analyzes the use of symbolism and uses of mythology that the North Korean government applies to legitimizing the authority of the Kim regime. And we were actually fortunate that the publisher allowed us to do that because otherwise the book would have been oddly apolitical, which in a Korean context is very difficult to justify. So when we talk about the stories and read them, we'll put them into a somewhat of a cultural context for you. And what I'll do now is I'll switch the screen over to sharing our slideshow, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so let me find our slides. And you can just tell me when you want me to move on.
Looks good. Could you make it full screen?
So we'll go to full screen.
Great. I do want to say before we start the reading, everything that he said also applies to South Korea. If any of you were aware in the news of the failed military coup, for example, or not even military, the failed just coup from the very top in South Korea, we have a full section about the political history of South Korea and the mythologizing of its founding as well, or its separation from North Korea as well, that I think ended up being very prescient. So that's something to keep in mind too, just the very, very recent history as we read to tonight. Also, I just wanted to say, before we continue, thank you, Olivia, as well, for the very kind introduction of us at the beginning of the talk. We appreciate it.
Of course.
All right, so, Dad, could you move it to the first story? Thank you. So, what's a better place to start than with the foundation myth that almost everyone in Korea knows? This is the story of Tangun, the first, I could say, myth of a human king, fully human king. Well, I suppose that's a little debatable, but you'll see in Korea. And all the images included will make sense in a moment. This version of the story that I'm about to read is sourced mainly from a text called the Samguk Yusa, or Memorabilia of the Three Kingdoms. It's a 13th century text that was compiled by a Buddhist monk named Iryon, and it was partially compiled to both spread Korea's history and mythology to its then Mongol rulers, but also to just preserve it due to the invasions. So here we go. Tangun, the first king of Korea. With only very minor variations between different versions of the story, what follows here is the story of how Korea's first king, known as Tangun, the Sandalwood King, or Tangun Wangol, was born. The Lord of Heaven Hwanin had a son named Hwanung, heavenly hero, who wanted to govern humanity. Hwanin granted his son's wish, giving him 3 heavenly treasures or seals, and sent him to earth. Accompanied by a retinue of 3,000 spirits, Prince Hwanung descended to the summit of the Taebaek Mountains, beneath the sacred sandalwood tree. Together with the Earl of Wind and Chancellors Rain and Cloud, Hwanung supervised all aspects of life, such as agriculture, justice, and medicine. At that time, near the sacred tree, a bear and a tiger were living together in a cave. They deeply wished to become human, and every day at the base of the tree, they asked that Hwanung transform them. Hwanung was moved by their earnest desire. He gave them 20 garlic bulbs and a bundle of mugwort and said to them, "If you eat these and stay inside your cave for 100 days, you will become human." So the bear and tiger took the garlic and mugwort and went inside their cave, where they fasted for 21 days. The tiger wasn't able to continue the fast and left the cave, but the bear endured the hunger and became a beautiful human woman named Ungnyo, literally bear woman. As there was no one she could marry, Ungnyo again went to the base of the sacred tree every day and asked to have a child. Hwanung himself changed his form and married her. She became pregnant and had a son, Tangun, who would reign as the first human king of the peninsula. Tangun created a new capital at what is now known as Pyongyang province, which is located in Manchuria. That's not Pyongyang as in the Pyongyang in North Korea, and gave the kingdom the name Chosun, which we now call Go-Joseon. Later, he moved this capital city, which was called Asadal, to a mountain, possibly what is now Mount Wǒl. Tangun ruled the nation for 1,500 years, and it is said that when he abdicated the throne to the next king, he became a mountain god.
Okay.
And we're
So,
going to continue the theme of animals in the next story.
right. So I'm going to be reading from my screen, so I have to unmaximize the screen here. So hold on a second while how do I even get out of the maximize screen? Okay. I think I did it. All right. So the story of Tangun is very interesting because it shows you that the Koreans are literally the clan of the cave bear, and it's a story whose elements come from the period before the imported religious traditions. So these are indigenous ideas and also shamanic ideas. Many of the other foundation myths in Korea, or just about all of them, also refer to the sun and their founding figures hatching from eggs or some round circular objects, right?
And this
Now,
story is so old, it's very hard to say when its origin even is. Um, that current form is the 13th century, but it was so old before that, we really don't exactly know when it would have first been told.
and now the next story will be about the rabbit's liver. And by that period, what you find is that the stories will include not only indigenous elements, but also Taoist elements, and many elements that will be familiar to people who know about Chinese culture. For example, the Dragon King. Um, the idea of eating a liver to cure disease is also part of folk medicine, but also Chinese medicine and what you might classify as Korean superstition. And of course, this story is one of the stories that follows a very prominent theme in Korean folklore, which is about the cleverness of the weak in relation to the, I guess, what you might think of as the dumbness or the denseness of the powerful. So I think I can share the slide and read my thing at the same time. Okay. So it won't be maximized on your screen. So throughout Korean folktales, one would often encounter the theme of a seemingly ordinary being outwitting even the highest of authority figures, and the rabbit's liver is a prime example. Long ago, the Dragon King, who lives under the southern sea, was very sick. His doctors told him that the only thing that would cure his illness was the liver of a rabbit. So the Dragon King called all of his advisors together and asked who would go looking for the liver of a rabbit. The humble turtle volunteered. He swam to the world of the land, where he came up to a sandy beach, and he found a rabbit. I have been sent by the Dragon King, the turtle said. He has invited you to come and be his guest in the Dragon Palace. The rabbit accepted the invitation. He sat on the turtle's back, and they swam down to the bottom of the southern sea. He was excited to see all the magnificent sights. But when they reached the palace and stood before the Dragon King, it didn't take long for the rabbit to learn that he had been tricked. I regret that I must eat your liver to regain my health, said the Dragon King. I give you my thanks now before my doctors take you away. At first, the rabbit was scared, but he was clever. Your Majesty, he said, I would be honored to be the one who cures you, but I'm afraid my liver is a very valuable organ, and so I keep it safely hidden in a secret place in the forest. If you would have the turtle take me back to the surface, I will gladly return with my liver. The Dragon King was very impressed by the rabbit's devotion and honesty, and so he ordered the turtle to take him back. When they arrived once again at the beach where the turtle had found him, the rabbit hopped off the turtle's back. Thank you for the ride, he said. Did you think I was really going to let your stupid Dragon King cut me open and take my liver? And the clever rabbit dashed off into the forest. And you can see this motif is actually quite popular. It's a very popular children's story because, of course, the kids all identify with the rabbit. And that wooden doll of the rabbit and turtle is a great example of how it has affected folk art.
There
The
was,
other, yeah, Bella, you can talk about the rabbit in the moon theme.
oh, yeah, so there's also a theme I would say that's kind of inherited from Chinese myth. Um, you really can't talk about the myths of one part of East Asia without kind of touching on all of them. That the rabbit like lives in the moon and creates medicine there. That's what's being depicted in that painting. I was going to say that people may be curious about what a dragon king is. Uh, there's a whole section in the book about the Korean dragon, but basically in Korea, dragons were more associated with clouds, storms, water, and any significant body of water would have its own dragon king. It's like both an individual figure, but also just a huge series of figures. But the one in this story would be one that would have a lot of authority as the Dragon King of a sea like that. Um,
Okay.
Now the first story we talked about, the story of Tangun, as he pointed out, delves into Korea's shamanistic tradition. This story is going to give the mythical origin of all the Korean shamans on the peninsula. And shamanism is very significant in Korean culture. There was a time when basically every village would have its own shaman. And on the mainland of the peninsula, shamans were mostly born female. And this story is going to be about the mother of all of them. And the themes of this story are connected to many different religious traditions, from shamanism to Confucianism to Buddhism. They all speak to Korea's cultural values. Princess Pari and the origin of female shamans. It is one of the most important examples of a legend that exemplifies female virtue. Long, long ago, there was a king named Ogu. He was only 14 when a fortune teller told him he'd have a fine heir if he married Lady Kilde. So Ogu agreed to marry her, and an astrologer was consulted to pick an auspicious date for the wedding. The king was warned to abide by the law of heaven, but he was young and impatient, and he made Kilde his queen one day early. Misfortune after misfortune fell upon them. The queen bore 6 daughters in a row. Even though the king's advisors tried to comfort him and said, surely the next child would be a son, the king brooded. Meanwhile, the queen had a taemong, birth dream, portending that her next child would be an exile from the heavenly kingdom, the daughter of an immortal named Myǒng-wål, guardian of the elixir of life. When the 7th child was another girl, the king was furious and disowned Gilde, commanding she be cast out to die. Before the eyes of her weeping mother, the infant was sealed in a stone chest that was then taken out to sea and thrown into the deepest part of the ocean. The chest sank. But how could heaven allow such cruelty to an innocent? Divine intervention came to the infant's rescue. In various versions of the tale, it's the Dragon King, the Buddha, or even a huge stork. And the chest floated back up. Eventually, the currents carried it to shore, where it landed at the feet of a kindly old Buddhist monk. He noticed the king's seal on the chest and, thinking it held a great treasure, took it to the local temple to be opened. But to the monk's horror, a baby girl was inside. The monks had all heard the story of the king's 7th daughter and knew they would be punished for saving her life. But they were holy men and wouldn't let her come to harm, and so the old monk hid her in the temple and raised her as his own. He named her Pari, which was short for Paritegi, the little abandoned or thrown away one. As Pari grew, she showed great intelligence and signs of divine favor. When she was old enough to ask about her parents, the old monk told her, your father is the spirit of bamboo and your mother is the Polonia. Pari paid her respects to the spirits of these plants as if they were her ancestors. One day, a shaman came to the temple, searching for the king's 7th daughter. The king is gravely ill, the shaman said to the monk, and he will die unless his missing daughter is found. We fear King Ogu's wrath, said the monk. He commanded his daughter be put to death. How will our temple fare if she's discovered here? How do we know this isn't a ruse to find her and kill her? You need not fear the king now. His 6 daughters have all failed him, and now he seeks the 7th out of desperation and a change of heart. And so it was revealed to Pari that she was the king's daughter, and she returned to the palace to much rejoicing. But the king was still gravely ill. The only way to cure him would be for one of his children to find a medicine in the distant west, in a heavenly land beyond India. In some versions of the story, both the king and queen have fallen ill. The king's other daughters had been too afraid to make the long and perilous journey, but Pari agreed. Donning men's clothing, Pari set off on her quest to Sochon Sobuk, literally West Sky, West Country, meaning the Western Paradise. She traveled for thousands of li, across wide plains, over high mountains, and fording great rivers. She even journeyed through the underworld, and once she reached her destination, she had to marry a giant and bear him sons in exchange for the medicine to heal her father. After 7 long years, she journeyed back through the underworld, freeing the spirits of the unjustly deceased as she went. When she returned to this world, she cured the king, who forgave her for marrying without his permission. Pari became the goddess who presides over death rites, which are said to be named Olgu after her father. Men carry a bamboo pole, and women carry a pole cut from a polonial tree. Polonia tree. Sorry, I just saw someone in the chat make an amusing comment. In funeral processions, because Princess Pari treated the bamboo and Polonia as her parents. And because Princess Pari was unjustly cast away and endured great trials, journeying through the underworld and communing with the dead, yet remained virtuous, faithful, and devoted all the while, the female shamans of Korea trace their lineage back to her. So that story is a lot and highlights Korea's cultural values in many ways. I'm sure that the fact that Patty did all of that for her father, who murdered her mother and tried to murder her, might be really alarming. But filial piety like this, or sorry, piety like this in Korea is very, very embedded in their Neo-Confucian culture. And this trend of women being extremely self-sacrificial and both being very heroic and very powerful, but then also giving so much up for people such as their sons, fathers, older brothers, that men in their lives who may even treat them very poorly, and then being rewarded for it in these myths, is a very common theme that we'll keep seeing throughout these stories.
Okay. So shall we move on to the next one?
Yes, I think the next story also connects to that theme, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
Yes, it definitely does.
So this one is the green frog. Now one thing about Korean shamanism is that in anthropology, it's classified as one of the ecstatic traditions. That means it's the shamans go into the trance state, not by taking drugs, but by dancing and by playing music. And in the peninsula of Korea, historically, most of the shamans were women, although in ancient prehistory, the ruling family was probably all shamanic. The kings and queens were shamans, and in the peninsula, the majority of the practicing shamans are women, but shamanism is also one of the cultural categories in which men can actually be shamans too, although they may dress like women. And then in the Jeju Island, which is the island off the southern tip of Korea, between Korea and Japan, there's an inversion where the women actually are like the patriarchs of the family. And in that island, the shamanic tradition is mostly practiced by men. It's a very interesting and almost structurally predictable inversion of culture and gender roles. Okay. Now, this story, the green frog, is this is one of those stories that every Korean really knows. And of all the stories in the book, this is probably one that in many ways reflects Korean psychology the best. Every kid growing up was probably called the green frog at one time. In Korean, the term is actually 청개구리. And the word 청 is the same as the Chinese word qing, and it means both blue and green. So the green frog has often been mistranslated as the blue frog. Okay. So many Korean folktales involve sacrifices of and filial piety owned towards mothers. one of the most famous folk tales on this theme is the story of the small green frog who always does the exact opposite of what his mother tells him. So when she says, go out and play, he wants to stay in the house. When she says it's time to eat, he wants to go out and play. When she says go to the mountain, he goes to the rice paddies. So when she grows old and she knows that she's going to die soon, she realizes that if she wants her son to bury her properly on the mountain, she's going to have to use reverse psychology. So she calls him to him one day and very solemnly tells him, you have to promise to bury me by the river when I die. And so the son promises. But when she dies, her son regrets never having listened to her while she was alive. And finally, he does what she told him to do. And so that's why now, whenever there's a heavy rain, you hear the frogs croaking, because it's the green frog worried that his mother's grave will be swept away by the rain. Now, the term 청개구리 is interesting because this is almost all Korean folktales are very heavily involved with wordplay. And the word Chung, although it means green in this context, can also be written with the Chinese character pronounced Chung, which means to make a plea. So at the end of the story, the frog is actually making a plea to heaven to protect his mother's grave. And also the I guess the wordplay and the fact that both Korean and Chinese and actually Japanese too, they all use the same character to mean both blue and green. It brings up lots of questions like were Asians colorblind, right? Were they like the Greeks who thought the sky was black? Uh, but and this was a really interesting question. When I was talking at the Smithsonian, there was the Korean ambassador was there, and when I pointed out that green and blue meant the same thing, because he had seen a translation of the green frog written as the blue frog, um, and I said, it's interesting that Koreans don't have any confusion about whether it means green or blue. And he said, I never thought about that. And I said, even in the native Korean term, parang can be blue or green. So we were walking towards the ambassador's residence, and we were walking by a traffic light, and I pointed at the green light, and I said, see the green light up there, and see the skies in the background. What color is the light? He said, oh, that's Chung. I said, what color is the sky? And he said, that's Chung. I said, you just used the same word for both, but are they the same color? And he said, no. And then he scratched his head and he said, yeah, I never thought about that. But we never have a confusion about it. So one of those cultural things. Okay. So Bella, you can take over and go to the
Uh,
Goblins Club.
yes. I'm not sure how to transition to this story from that very tragic one. I suppose something I could say is, oh, could you scroll down a little bit so everyone can see what the captions
Okay.
are on the images? Thank you. Um, Something I will say is that as these stories we've been reading have shown, in Korea, there's almost a hierarchy for example, between family members and community members in terms of, you need to venerate people who are above you, older than you, your elders. Women have to give so much up, like for their husbands. Um, the poor need to work. And then maybe one day they'll become wealthy. Uh, but myths are often for common people. And this folk tale sort of indicates that where an older brother who is wicked gets punished, and a younger brother who is very pious and kind, um, and initially impoverished gets rewarded. And the implication is if you are sacrificial enough, things will work out. This story is also a story about a self-sacrificial man. Uh, it's not a domain solely of women, and this sort of shows uh, the type of sacrifice men are expected to make. Once there lived two brothers. The rich older brother was spoiled and selfish, while the poor younger brother was a filial, hard-working woodcutter. Each day he rose at the crack of dawn to go into the hills and gather wood. One day he'd worked especially hard, and as he was resting under a tree, an acorn fell beside him. "This one's for my father," he said, and picked it up. Another acorn fell, and another, and another. He picked them up and said, "This one's for my mother. This one's for my older brother. This one's for his wife." He put the acorns in his pocket and got his load of wood to carry back home. Darkness fell suddenly, and frightened by the eerie calls of the cuckoo, the older brother lost his way. After the longest time, he found an abandoned house in the woods. He was so tired that he went inside, but he was plagued by anxious thoughts and could not sleep. He was tossing and turning when he heard gruff voices and a loud commotion. Quickly he hid inside a closet. Just then, a gang of goblins came into the room, and you can see the origin of that term on the slide. Each of them held a large wooden club. They gathered in a circle and beat the floor. "Make gold, tuk tak," they shouted, and a pile of gold appeared on the floor. "Make silver, tuk tak," they chanted, and a pile of silver appeared. The younger brother was terrified, afraid to make even the smallest noise. But even in his terror, he was hungry, and his stomach rumbled. Instantly, the goblins stopped their chanting. "What was that sound?" one asked. They all looked around. "Thunder," said another. "Let us hurry before rain comes. The roof is leaky on this old shack." When the goblins started again, the younger brother realized he was doomed if his stomach rumbled again. He had to eat something to quiet it. He searched his pockets and found the acorns. As quietly as possible, he put one in his mouth and gently bit down. There was a loud crack. The goblins scattered in terror. "Get out! It's the roof beam!" The woodcutter's heart had nearly exploded from fright. He remained in the closet all night, and it was only at sunrise that he came out and found the piles of gold, silver, and jewels. He gasped, but eventually came to his senses. He unloaded the wood and loaded up his A-frame with as much treasure as he could carry instead. He noticed the goblin had dropped a magic club, too, so he took that as well. He became the richest man in town, and used the treasure to build a palatial house and invited his parents to live there with him. Whenever he needed money, he just used the club and said the magic words. But the woodcutter's older brother was terribly jealous. He visited his younger brother and asked him for the story behind his wealth. The younger brother happily told him, but the older brother wasn't really listening, only imagining the treasure and wealth he could obtain. That night, the older brother put on his oldest clothes, put on his A-frame, chopped a load of firewood as fast as he could, then sat under the oak tree as described. An acorn fell. "An acorn for me," he said. Then another fell, and another, and another. "Another one for me, another for me to eat," he exclaimed. Pockets full of acorns, he set off on his way. The sky grew dark, and he heard the cuckoo crying. But he wasn't terrified like his brother had been. He took off his A-frame and went into the shack, then waited impatiently. It felt like it took forever for the goblins to arrive. As soon as the goblins began their game, he couldn't wait any longer. He bit into an acorn with a loud crack. "So the greedy fool has returned," a goblin said. "He tricked me out of my magic club last time. Let's teach him a lesson." The goblin jerked the closet door open, and the man tumbled out. The goblins beat him mercilessly. "Flatten him, tuk-tak!" And when the club landed, he flattened like a blanket. "Stretch him, tuk-tak!" And the brother became long and thin like a bamboo pole. All night the goblins had their fun with him. At dawn they finally left, leaving him long and thin. The older brother put his A-frame over his thin, gangly shoulders and staggered back home. And I'm going to read what we conclude about the story in the book itself. For a culture in which people often had less than they needed to subsist, stories of sacrifice and unexpected wealth served the important functions of reinforcing social control or acting as escapism. This story serves both purposes. Given the Korean idealization of Confucianism, it may be surprising to see that one of the story's central characters is a wicked older brother. But then folk tales are usually told by and for the common people. Just as many Korean folk tales are critical of authority, so too are they critical of many aspects of the Neo-Confucian social order and how it can result in exploitation and abuses of power. Despite this critical nature, the Goblin's Club story also helps propagate the system. It suggests that even if someone you're supposed to venerate is wicked, as long as you retain your virtues, outside forces will eventually punish the wrongdoer. Although at the same time, it serves as humorous escapism.
So now we'll conclude with some amusing stories. And these are the kinds of stories that you might hear on the playground where kids tell each other, or these might be the sorts of things that, I'm always reminded me of Calvin and Hobbes, where Calvin's dad tells him ridiculous stories about the origins of things or how color didn't begin until the 1950s, right? Uh, these also qualify as explanatory tales, and they're ones that are they're also kind of time specific. So the first one is a story that just frightens kids and makes it impossible for them to go to the bathroom without anxiety. This is back in the day when Koreans had outhouses. And it's a cautionary tale about the red hand. So for Korean school children, one of the best known and most terrifying stories is the one about the red hand, particularly because it's so close to their daily experience. The traditional Korean schools didn't have flush toilets. They just had like the toilet that just was a hole in the floor, right? So it's a story with many variants. In fact, I found versions of it as far afield as India. But the key to it is to scare the listener during the performance. So typically the story is about a boy who has to go to the outhouse at night, already a very scary thing for children, especially in the past when they had to go out with a candle, or if they were in a wealthy family, a flashlight, right? Because children tend to be afraid of the dark. And in the Korean toilet, being afraid of potentially falling in to the pit is not unwarranted. After the boy has relieved himself and realizes that he has forgotten to bring toilet paper, he hears a voice from below. And it's a deep voice that says, "Would you like white paper or black paper?" Of course, the boy is terrified. In some versions of the story, he's spared if he chooses the right paper and only has to endure the horror of the red hand emerging from below to wipe his bottom. If he chooses the wrong color paper, the hand grabs him and drags him down into the tank where he drowns in feces and urine. In some versions of the story, the boy manages to escape, but the following night he has to go to that house again. This time he takes a knife, and when the red hand emerges, he chops it off and runs away. The next day, the boy notices a fellow student at school who has dark circles under his eyes, holding his arm in a funny way. And when the boy asks what's wrong, the other student lunges forward, showing a bloody stump, shouting, "You chopped off my hand," right? And at that point in the story, the storyteller, who's usually an older kid, leaps at the audience and grabs some unwitting kid and scares the daylights out of him, right? So well into the 20th century, Korean public schools lacked flush toilets, and the toilet stalls had tanks below them, which made the possibility of this red hand story much more real. And even into the 1980s, many homes, especially in small towns and rural areas, had outhouses that were emptied out periodically by what were euphemistically called honey wagons that would process the waste for its use as fertilizer in the agricultural fields. But even today, with flush toilets, the story has endured. In contemporary times, with unisex public toilets, there's a more realistically frightening story based on actual news reports, which has nothing to do with the Red Hand, but with spy cams in toilet stalls that live stream on the internet, right? So the themes of the stories tend to be the same, although the elements tend to differ. Okay. And a couple others. So one that's like an inversion of the colonial idea that all foreigners look alike, right? So in Korea, there's a story about how all foreigners look alike. This is an apocryphal one, and it probably has some historical validity to it, although I wasn't able to find an actual source. Many people in the diplomatic corps knew this story from the early time just following the Korean War, right? So in Korea, the idea is that all Westerners look alike. And in Korea, this stereotype is extended to a real problem many Westerners have in remembering Korean names, right? Because all Korean names are nearly 3 syllables, and so many Koreans have the surname Pak, Kim, or Lee that in Korea the story is if you throw a stone into any crowd, it will hit somebody named Park, Kim, or Lee. In the early days after Korea's liberation from Japan, between 1945 and 1950, the story goes, a Korean laborer was beaten to death by a Westerner in broad daylight in the public market in Seoul, in front of hundreds of eyewitnesses. By the time the police arrived, the killer was long gone, but given the number of witnesses and the fact that he was a foreigner, the police were pretty confident that they could quickly find him. But then they were terribly disappointed and also shocked by descriptions of the killer. All of the witnesses reported that he was tall, hairy, with a long nose, and round eyes, and with light hair. And many of them also reported that he smelled of spoiled milk. And all of those descriptions are the generic Korean stereotype of a foreign white man. When they were shown photos and asked whether they would be able to identify the murderer in a lineup, the witnesses said they all looked alike and they couldn't distinguish between them. So someone got away with murder in broad daylight because Koreans couldn't tell foreigners apart. When Westerners were first seen in Korea, they were called goblins because in Asia, goblins have round eyes and they're tall and have lots of body hair, right? And often have red or light hair. Whereas if you look at demonic representations in the West, they tend to have slanted eyes and are often quite angular, right? And then I'll end with an anecdote that I heard when I was a kid. And this was from one of my uncles who might have made this up when I think about it. But he said, Koreans were famous throughout the world. You may think, we're a small country, but in the old times, Korea was often consulted for important decisions, like how to name America. So he said, when a great European map maker of ancient times was finishing his map of the Western Hemisphere, he still didn't have a name for the continent that was discovered there. And he asked people far and wide until finally he came to a Korean. And he said, how should I name it? I'm desperate. No one can give me an appropriate name. The Korean was busy. And as usual, because the Korean was busy, he was especially annoyed being bothered by a Westerner. So he just snapped at the map maker and he said, 아무렇게나, meaning name the place however you want. Okay? the map maker, not knowing Korean, misheard, and he heard it as America, instead of Amuroke. And what a wonderful name, he said. And that's why the continents in the Western Hemisphere are called America. All a Korean annoyed by a Western map maker. So yeah, that concludes our stories, and we can open it up for a Q&A now.
I just realized you should say, what decade you heard that story, like when when he told you that.
Yeah, well, I'm not that old, so that would have been in the mid 1960s. But the story may be a little older than that, and the same story has been told in the 70s, and I even heard it in the 80s. But its origins probably go back to right after the Korean War.
Just want to
So if
say,
anyone has questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
I just want to say how delightfully interesting this was. I had no idea, and I found it really very, very interesting.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Also,
You
thank
have
you
a-
everyone for coming tonight. There are so many people. We really appreciate it.
I do have a question. Can you name an example where one of these Korean myths has been adapted in other countries of the world?
Um, well, um, so the story of Princess Pari, for example, you will find Chinese variants of that have many of the same elements from the beginning and the end, but then in the middle, it also explains why the statues of Kuan Yin often have 1,000 arms. So, so there are variants like that. Um, there's a Korean origin story about the sun and the moon, which is like the inversion of Little Red Riding Hood, right? You know how Little Red Riding Hood is a girl who's who leaves her house and is pursued by a wolf. In the Sun and the Moon story, the tiger comes to the house. And there's a Chinese variant of that story that's called Grand Aunt Tiger, which is very similar, but doesn't have the origin of the sun and the moon worked into it.
I feel like that's the difficult thing, right? Like, of the stories we featured in the book and in this talk, there are so many of them that are similar to other stories around the world, but it's really hard to say, what story came first, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah,
there's
so
the story we didn't cover here called that some people call like the Korean Cinderella as well, right?
yeah, and if you're a folklorist, one of the theoretical debates has always been between dispersion, which is a theory that folktales originate in one place and then they are carried to other places, versus the idea of independent origin. But if you're a writer or an artist, you know that in many cases, given the universality of human nature and living conditions, there are actually many predictable themes that will go together. So lots of stories have independent origin, even if they're similar. And then when they run across each other, what happens is they often generate hybrid stories. And then like in the Korean American community, many of these stories have been slightly changed. So, for example, um, I remember when I taught at Vassar, there was a Korean American academic who was talking about identity, and she was reminiscing about how the story of the blue frog was so important to her because the frog was blue. And that's what made it unique, right? Not only did the frog not listen, it did the opposite of what it was supposed to do. Its color was also blue. And so after her talk, I asked her, who told you that story? And she said, well, my mother told me that. Um, and I said, well, did you know that it should be the green frog? And that what your mother did was probably looked it up. She looked up in the dictionary the translation of the of Chong, and in the dictionary she got blue. So she actually mistakenly told you the story of the blue frog when it should have been the green frog, and that really uh, gave gave this academic an entirely different spin because she hadn't considered the issue of language, and also the idea that you could conscientiously try to translate something but get it wrong, and the error would not be your own fault because of the way things like dictionaries work. So when folklore is transmitted, things like that happen when things are misheard. For example, there's a picture book of the Korean Cinderella in which a very important element is totally wrong. So there's a scene where the girl is supposed to fill a big jug full of water, and in the original story, right, the hole is closed by a tukobi, which is a
A
toad.
toad. But
But
it got someone misinterpreted that as tokebi, goblin.
and you can see how tokebi and tukobi would sound similar, right? Like Amurakena and America to a Westerner. So there's the picture book of the Korean Cinderella in English has that detail wrong.
I saw someone in the chat asking what that story is called. It's Kongchi.
Yeah, Kongchi Pachi. And the Kong and Pat, the G part sounds like mouse. Although if you're an etymologist, you know that G is also a diminutive ending. And Kong and Pat are two different kinds of beans that are used. Kong would be like soybeans, which would be common, right? Because Koreans eat lots of bean sprouts. And then Pat is the black bean that would be ground and used in festive foods. So of course you can predict that Pachi is the bad sister, right?
I also saw a couple other questions in the chat. Someone asked what like qualities are required of people being noted as a hero in Korean myth. I'm not sure whether that means like heroes just throughout Korean myth, or if you mean what we meant by hero, like in the book's title, but there are many qualities. I would say some are highlighted in the story, such as a selfless nature, cleverness. There are so many stories of trickster figures. Often, and this is like a Confucian idea, heroes and heroic people are noted as being especially beautiful, and especially intelligent. There are many stories of people who are heroic who get the highest score on the civil service exam. But there are different types of archetypes of hero. Not all of them are necessarily like that. There are also stories of mythified real people who we can confirm historically existed, where their deeds get framed as especially heroic, and maybe how they appeared in real life is altered in the telling a little bit.
Yeah,
But it really
one of
depends.
so if you're looking for like some essential quality that would say distinguish a Korean hero from a different kind of hero, it would probably be intelligence or cleverness, or the ability to use trickery or some kind of stratagem to outwit or defeat some larger force. And you can find that historically as well, like during the Imjin War, where the Japanese invaded Korea, and the Admiral Yi, with only a couple of hundred turtle ships, which were the first ironclad warships, was able to defeat the whole Japanese Navy many times over, right? So those are the kinds of things you see. And also the ability to stay within Confucian propriety. So one of the great Korean generals was General Kim Il-sung, and on his way to fight the Chinese during one war, his soldiers were marching past his hometown, and so he needed to check on the welfare of his mother because he was also needed to be a good son, but he couldn't exactly get off his horse and go to the house and check with his mother. So what he did was he asked one of his lieutenants. He said, "Go to that house over there and ask for some of her doenjangguk, which would be like a fermented miso soup." Okay, so the lieutenant doesn't quite know what that means, so he goes and finds this old woman there, and he asks for a bowl of the soup, and he rushes to the front of the column and gives it to the general, and the general tastes the soup, and he says, "Yes, my mother is fine." Right? So those are the kind of things you see in Korean heroes that might distinguish them from others.
Let's see. I also noticed someone asked, I'd love to hear more about bears in Korean mythology, if you'd care to expand on that. Well, that's a rabbit hole. Bears in Korean mythology, I mean, I would say they kind of trace their origin back to ancient shamanic tradition, right? In terms of their importance.
Yeah, and in the contemporary times, you don't see that many bear stories because bears are pretty much extinct on the Korean peninsula.
Yeah.
But in the old stories, there are, and this is actually true throughout the world, right? As you all know, like the Arctic Circle means the circle of the bear, right? Arctos means bear, and in cultures that live in it's called the circumpolar bear cult. All cultures in that Arctic Circle region have stories about bears, and almost all of them also have stories about bears that transform into humans, marriages between male bears and female, right, humans, and vice versa. And so Korea is part of the circumpolar bear cult. And in ancient times, there would have been stories about transformation and marriage with bears.
And speaking of like ancient Korea, that image on the slide of the gilt bronze like bear table legs that date back to when Korea was presided over by Han China, those would have been created like between 100 to around 30 BCE. It's a very long time ago that bears were venerated in Korea or on the Korean Peninsula.
Any other things in the chat?
Let's see. Oh, someone asked, would you say the bear story can be used as a metaphor for trans identity? Maybe that means transgender in this instance. So I would say maybe not necessarily that story, but if you look at the story of Princess Pari, where she dresses in men's clothing to go on this journey, for example, or just stories in general that feature shamans, I might not even say an allegory or metaphor, to be honest. It's important that when you look at shamanic tradition in Korea, you know, when spirits inhabit a shaman, when they channel them, if that spirit is of a different gender, the idea would be they literally become that other gender. It's not necessarily considered like a performance. They actually become that gender. If a shaman who was born female channels like the great general spirit who is male, they would become male. And we talk about this more in the book itself. Signs that someone is destined to become a shaman, that that's their calling in life. some of those symptoms overlap with what we here may refer to as gender dysphoria, or what's referred to as that nowadays. So, being transgender and being a shaman are very closely interlinked. And in the past, or even today, people in any sort of marginalized group would have an opportunity to earn an income, to have some more freedom with self-expression through being a shaman, although the category of shaman was also its own sort of marginalized group, sometimes considered like people in a lower class of society. So it's a complex issue. What do you think, Dad?
Yeah, yeah, shamanism is a pretty complex issue in South Korea, especially this past decade, because the last president's administration collapsed partially because of charges that she was consorting with a fortune teller and shaman who was giving her advice about national policy. But in traditional Korea, or actually, I can talk about when I was a kid. I was living in a haunted house, and when the neighbor's child died tragically in a car accident, and so they had a shamanic ceremony to allow his spirit to pass over into the next world because they didn't want their house also haunted. The house I lived in was haunted by various figures, like a Japanese colonel and people who had died during the Korean War. But at that shamanic ceremony, I still remember very vividly. I was about 6 or 7. When the shaman was possessed by the spirit of the great general, it literally was a different person. She didn't just sound different. She didn't just have a deep voice and behave differently. It's like she exuded an energy that was clearly not herself. It was actually quite frightening. Um, in my mother's village, when she was young, all the girls were trained on how to be proper girls. Like they were trained in their feminine behavior by a male shaman who often, or I think during the later years, he usually dressed like a woman. And the story about him was that during the Japanese occupation, he would transform. He would literally transform into a woman and seduce the Japanese soldiers. So it's a cultural category that's actually quite malleable. And in recent years, like if you look at Korean media today, you can see that in TV shows and in movies, the trans shaman, usually a man who's behaving like a woman or who's a trans woman, has become almost the stereotypical figure. 20 years ago, that would have been seen as very radical. But Korean religion is quite interesting because even in Korean Christianity, if you look at how particular, what would you call them? I guess they're clusters. If you've ever been in Korea and you look at the hills at night, you see these multicolored neon crosses all over the place in the dark. Almost looks like a cemetery, but those are the churches. Those are Protestant churches. And the demographics of each church, right? So the congregation of each church, if you compare it to the clients of shamans during traditional times, lines up almost 1-to-1. So the shamanic tradition has become Christianized, but many of the same things are still going on. So that's why Korean religion is classified as a syncretic religion that simply it's a culture that expediently or effectively borrows other traditions and merges them into one that it handles uniquely on its own.
Let's see. I noticed one more question here about, does the number 7 play any role of significance in Korean myth? For some, the seventh son in some cultures is fortunate, but in Princess Patty, the seventh daughter got sentenced to death. Well, I think if our book had been like 200 pages longer, couldn't we have had a full section
Yeah.
on auspicious and inauspicious numbers?
Yeah, we actually had to make our book about 100 pages too short. Yeah, so the most obvious one is the 7 stars, right? The Chisong.
Which we
and
do
this,
get to talk about in the book.
yeah, and the 7 stars would be associated with the Big Dipper, which is right, which is associated with the. You come to think of it, it's associated with the bear, right?
And like in Princess Patty, the story sort of like has a heroic Buddhist character as well. The Chosung are they were an ancient deity or series of deities involved in funerary rituals that later like became a sort of Buddhist trope in Korea. So that ties directly to how Princess Patty is the presider over death rites. Another thing I think of is 7. That's 7 goes into the number 49 7 times, right? And 49 is a very significant number in Buddhism in general and Korean Buddhism, right?
Yeah, so 49 is the number of days that it takes for a soul to reincarnate. So in some Buddhist traditions, there's actually a 49-day vigil to make sure that the spirit goes on to a better incarnation. And that's coincidentally, it turns out that biologically, for a human body to be entirely dead, it takes about 49 days. And it's also 49 days when the fetus develops a brain.
All right. I think we're about at time here, but I wanted to say again, thank you so much. I've already gotten some really good feedback. I think everybody was very excited about this. And for those of you that now want to get your hands on a copy of the book, we did donate 10 copies to the Kingston Library. They should, at least some of them, still be available. And again, thank you so much, Bella and Insu. We are so appreciative.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you for having us. And thank you everyone like in the chat for your kind words as well. We really appreciate it.
yeah,
Thank you
and,
again. I hope we can stay in touch.
yeah, and I hope it's been a nice study break. And thank you all again for coming at a very busy and stressful time of year.
And there was one question in the chat, will the video be available? I did record, so I will see when and where I will be able to put that up.
Okay,
And we
great.
would also really love to have the file if that would be possible.
Of course. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay,
Have a
great.
good night.
Yeah, so yeah, everyone have a great night.
Have a nice night. Thank you.